Hafid everyone, thank you for joining us today for our talk on mangroves. So we're going to welcome back Kara from last week, who gave her last talk on seagrasses. And so today she's going to talk about mangroves. So thank you, Kara, for coming back second week in a row. And we look forward to your talk. So without further ado, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Leilani. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see the presentation. Right, looks good. All right, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I'm sorry about the mistake with the link. I'm so glad we were able to find the right place. I hope this presentation can be a valuable resource for you for learning about mangroves, and we can have some more discussion at the end. And thank you also to those of you who've already offered your input and helped make this presentation happen. Please turn off your cameras and your microphones for now. If you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. We'll start off with some of the basic information about what mangroves are and what they do, and then we'll move into where they are and some of our management and conservation strategies. So starting off with their biology and ecology, what are mangroves? Mangroves are not defined by a particular genetic group, so they're not really genetically related to each other. It's not like how pine trees are kind of their own little group. Mangroves are simply defined by their ability to exist in the intertidal environment, so where the tide is going up and down. And they have special adaptations to help them survive in this habitat. So if you look at a mangrove root closely, you might notice some of these little dots on the surface, and those are called lenticels. They help the mangrove get oxygen directly from the air, as opposed to some other plants which live in more aerated soils. They don't need to have this specialized root system. Mangroves also often have like waxy leaves and the ability to excrete salt or keep salt out, even though they're living in that salty environment. So they have pretty amazing biology to allow them to live in this harsh environment. Not all mangroves are the same level of salt tolerance though. Some live more seaward, they're able to handle those really salty conditions, some kind of in the middle, and some closer to land. So they have their different zones. The ones towards land maybe are only flooded by seawater in the highest of the high tides. This diagram, of course, is a little too conceptual. There's going to be ups and downs, and river inputs can also affect the distribution of our mangroves. So taking a closer look at what species we have here, our most seaward mangroves are those from the Rhizophora genus and Avicennia. They're really on the forefront most of the time. So they have these beautiful arching prop roots, kind of red. They're also known as the red mangrove. Avicennia have these pencil roots. They're like sticking straight out of the ground, like sharp pencils. Bruguiera has these like knee roots. They look kind of like knobby growths around the tree. And then at the very base of the trunk, buttress roots. And then Lunitsera has these like looping lateral roots. So they make these little loops on the sand. Lunitsera is a little bit less seaward. It's a little farther from the shoreline. And then mangroves also have special reproductive mechanisms, especially particularly these three. They have propagules, and propagules are a little different from seeds because they start life while still attached to the parent. Your typical seed will fall off. It can stay dormant for a while before it starts growth, but these are like ready to go. They're ready starting growth. Rhizophora propagules have kind of like a long string bean shape. Avicennia are more like a lima bean, and Bruguiera are kind of like Rhizophora, but a little bit more stout, kind of like a tiny cucumber. And then Lunitsera actually really does have seeds. So if you see those little brown things, those are the seeds. They develop from these bright red flowers that are very pretty. So just building upon that a little bit more, we call this vivipary, meaning starting life while still attached to the parent. Humans also do this too. So here's just a diagram. When you see this connected to the adult plant over here, this little brown part is technically the fruit. and the plant is breaking through the fruit wall. It might float around in the water for a bit until it sinks or it gets caught in some other mangrove roots or something else, and it starts to actually develop roots and grow. And this is what it would look like as a young seedling. We can also look at the propagules and the leaves and flowers as well to help us identify our species. So for Guam, we have reports of mucronata, stylosa, and apiculata. So the mangroves for the propagules are a little bit more curved for our apiculata, and a little bit for our stylosa. And then for our Avicennia, we have Avicennia marina and alba. And alba is a little bit pointier for both the leaves and the propagules. And then we have lots of other parts of the mangrove community. I focus more on the most seaward mangroves as the Coral Fellow, but we also have coastal strand plants that are salt tolerant. They live in the salt spray, but they're maybe not getting inundated with salt water. We have riverine mangroves like the nipa palm, which there's really more living in freshwater, but occasionally during like a really high tide might get a little bit of salt water. And then mangrove associates like this fern that live among the mangroves. There are also like vines. So all of these things are also really important. They have benefits for wildlife, for preventing erosion, increasing biodiversity. So definitely, although I'm not focusing on these, definitely something to learn more about in the future. And then for our actual mangrove animals, not just the plants, but things that live inside them, it's a pretty amazing intersection if you think about it, from the land and the sea and freshwater rivers and the air as well. So we have lots of invertebrates like crabs and snails that like to forage on the mangrove mud or perhaps on the roots. Things can attach to the roots like these bivalves, things with two shells. We have different kinds of fish. This is a milkfish. This is a silver moony. So some of them really like this brackish water environment where you're mixing salt water with fresh water. And then there's also lots of other things I don't have pictures of, different insects, different kinds of birds, other vertebrates like sea turtles have been reported to eat sponges off mangrove roots here, other lizards, and then there's super tiny stuff living on the surface of the mud as well. So really cool and beautiful, but also what do they do for us? What are their ecosystem services that they provide to humans? Some of you might have seen this already last week, so I apologize. There's some new info though. So this is a conceptual diagram of mangroves as a nursery habitat. Here we have the adults living out at the ocean and the coral reef. They spawn, they release eggs, and little fish larvae swim in, and they take shelter in the mangrove roots and the seagrasses. So the main benefit here that a lot of scientists would agree upon is that they're offering shelter. There's actually some debate about whether mangroves provide that useful nursery habitat in the Indo-Pacific, but it isn't so much Indo-Pacific versus Caribbean as it is like how often are the roots inundated. So if there's a big tidal range versus if it's always underwater. If it's always underwater, more things can grow on it, like corals can even grow on mangrove roots, sponges, sea squirts, and they don't have to worry about the tide going down and getting burnt up by the sun. Fish obviously also need the tide to be high enough to access the mangrove roots. So that will greatly affect the utility of the area as a nursery. And then other things like if there's seagrasses nearby, oftentimes they'll enhance the nursery capabilities. They'll be able to harbor more fish because sometimes fish will hide in the mangroves and then feed in the seagrasses and go back to the mangroves. So lots of things affect how well our mangroves serve as a nursery. This is a beautiful picture captured by Brent at TAWR showing all these little fish hiding in between mangrove roots here in Guam and tons of stuff growing on them. So they can be a very, very useful structure for fish to hide in and structure for stuff to attach to. And we do know, not down maybe to a great detail, but general idea of some fish that use the mangroves as a nursery. Juvenile barracuda will be found there, different snapper species. Derek Scott in 1993 also cataloged the wetlands of Oceania, and he also recorded jacks and groupers to be using the mangroves as nursery habitat. So there is a lot of stuff there. It's just sometimes hard to see when the water can be kind of murky. And we're getting a better idea as well of how mangroves support food webs. So the main argument so far has been they provide structure, but they also can provide food. But it's a little less easy to observe because it's detritus based. So not a lot of things like to eat the mangrove leaves directly. They're not that nutritious. They're really hard to digest. They have a lot of tannins in them. So what happens is the leaf falls down, microbes start breaking it down, fungi and bacteria, and it turns into just kind of like soapy, organic mush matter. And then little animals can feed on that, like this little amphipod. It's like a little shrimp crustacean thing. And then small fish can eat that, and so on up the food chain. So mangrove detritus is actually an important part of the food web. And you can see this in where mangroves are native versus where they're invasive. So this author did a study in Puerto Rico looking at the benthic animals living there, benthic meaning on the bottom, things that live on the bottom, and the community in Hawaii. And what they did is they used isotopes, so nitrogen and carbon, and they were able to track down what plants animals were eating. ML stands for mangrove leaf, M stands for macroalgae, and S stands for seagrass. So in the Puerto Rico habitat, they saw a bunch of things using macroalgae and seagrass, and a bunch of things using mangrove leaf, maybe not directly, but indirectly after it's been broken down a little bit. Where mangroves are invasive in Hawaii, you basically don't see anything really showing signs that it used mangrove leaves for food. Everything is clustering around macroalgae and seagrass. So mangrove communities have evolved over time to utilize mangrove detritus from their leaves. Here's another way to look at this. Leaf litter falls down, breaks down into particulate organic carbon, dissolved organic carbon that feeds crabs and other secondary consumers. Also really important part is the microbes and the benthic microalgae, so tiny algae that lives on the bottom. This can provide an even more important food source in some cases to crabs and snails and other things. If you ever see crabs on the mud and they're just like, they look like they're eating nothing, they're just eating the mud. They're often eating these super, super tiny bits of algae and other life living on the surface. There's also a lot of import and export. So some of this carbon gets eaten by animals and exported, like a bird leaves and takes that carbon away. But there's a lot of exchange. So here, this is a picture in southern Guam where you can see a ton of seagrass blades washed up among the roots of some mangroves. And those seagrass blades are decaying, and over time they might end up kind of settling into the mangrove sediment. So a lot of different studies will find like, oh, mangrove leaf production actually was captured in the seagrasses, and seagrasses were captured in the mangroves. And land, terrestrial plants, stuff from those plants were captured in the mangroves even more, making up even more of the sediment than the mangrove leaf themselves. So there's a lot of mixing going on along our coast, and they all kind of help slow down the water and capture this organic matter. So the leaves decompose, pretty rapidly. They're either eaten or washed away, they decompose. So they're not really the greatest carbon sink. So we're also thinking about if the carbon is eaten or if it kind of goes into the sediment where it can be stored and help limit the impacts of climate change. Most of the carbon that mangroves store is underground, and that's not necessarily from leaf litter so much as it is from the production of these root hairs, like tiny, tiny fine roots that are replacing themselves often. And this accumulates in anaerobic sediment, so sediment that does not have a lot of oxygen. There's not as much breakdown by bacteria. It's a little more difficult for them. And this can accumulate over many, many, many thousands of years until there's a lot of carbon stored. But that also means that if you damage the mangroves, if you cut them down and destabilize these sediments, they can act as a huge carbon source. So not only do you lose the mangrove that has been taking in carbon, you also release all the carbon that's been stored in the sediments under it. And here you can see in this graph, mangroves are really amazing at capturing carbon and fighting climate change. If you look at these rates, both they're above ground, but mostly below ground, their production and storage of carbon is much greater than any other typical forests. Mangroves are also super important for preventing erosion of the coastline. So here you can see a loss of fringing mangroves. Fringing just kind of means like the mangroves that are on the very edge of the shoreline, basically. And then the severe erosion that has occurred after those mangroves were lost. Mangroves are usually able to absorb waves and accumulate sediment. And we have these fringes of mangroves in Guam as well, along our southern coast. You can see just how thin it is because you can see this car driving through the mangroves. I'm standing on the other side in the water, and you can see this car driving on the road right through there. So really important to protect our fringes because they are so great at absorbing waves. It's not necessarily like a linear relationship, more mangroves, more wave absorption. Even a small area can have a huge impact. And restoring fringing mangroves is really hard. Once you lose them and the waves are there, it's hard for them to start growing there again. They also help particles settle, like I said, accumulating sediment. So not just stopping waves, but actively accumulating sediment. Here, for example, we have particles in fresh water that are negatively charged, kind of repelling each other. Once they reach salt water and they're mixing, they lose that a little bit. And then if you add in some mangrove-associated mucus, like snails living there, crabs living there, creating mucus, that helps the particles flocculate, form bigger clumps, and then settle out. Of course, if it's too rough, then they'll just get broken apart again. But oftentimes mangroves are able to help particles settle and capture a lot of that sedimentation coming from our rivers. They also can absorb stuff like nutrients and even like heavy metals. People have done experiments planting mangroves near waste treatment plants. They do have a limit, of course, and we want our mangroves to be healthy, but they do help absorb a lot of pollution and improve our water quality. All right, so moving to specific places, starting with our southern coast. So here's some different data on the extent of our mangroves. The green that you can see on this map represents data from the Coastal Change Analysis Program by NOAA. So this is like remote sensing data using just like not confirming it on the ground, just using the map itself. And then there's also this white line from the Manelgues Habitat Focus Area Atlas that Dr. Lori Raimundo worked on. And you can see it extends a little bit farther here. It's hard for those remote sensing program maybe to get this super narrow fringe down here. And then these two yellow dots represent what Scott in 1993 recorded the mangrove extent at. So he recorded it existing between these 2 points. So it was actually a little bit smaller compared to what Lori recorded in 2018. It might also just be because Scott didn't have like GIS, so it might have been harder for him to estimate the length. He also recorded it's 20 to 60 meters wide, so it might have been wider in certain areas as well. It's hard to tell exactly. This other report from 1975 showed very similar things to Scott. So around this, where this river empties all the way to this point, the mangroves existed, and a little bit here, which is true today as well. So in the south, a major threat to our mangroves is simply removal, cutting them down. It can take them a while to grow back, and cutting them down destabilizes the environment and can make it harder for them to grow back. So here are some mangroves that were cut down actually in Achan Reef Flat Preserve. There was an incident report, they were cut down and burned. It's not really certain why. So definitely understanding people's thoughts about mangroves and increasing education about their benefits is something that can help our southern mangroves. Another threat to them includes the impact of the invasive brown tree snake. In our southern mangroves, we have the Bruguiera species a little bit more, and a study was done looking at pollinators that visit Bruguiera between Guam and Saipan. And Saipan doesn't have the invasive brown tree snake and has way more visitors by wildlife to these flowers each day. And most of those visitors are by birds, which is indicated by this light gray, as opposed to the dark black color, which is insects. So the most common is the Micronesian honeyeater, which has been extinct in Guam. In Guam, the most common visitor to flowers was this beetle, and it's not necessarily equal in efficiency at pollinating. Bruguiera has a special pollination mechanism where the flower gets triggered and it goes like poof and releases pollen. So it has to kind of trigger this. And the birds do that, but the authors didn't really see the beetles doing that. So that's concerning. There might be a reproductive bottleneck for our Bruguiera trees in the south due to the invasive brown tree snake. Another thing concerning for both the mangroves and the people is, of course, sea level rise. As climate change occurs and sea level rise occurs, the mangroves have two choices. They either have to accrete enough sediment to keep up with the sea level rising or retreat a little bit more upland. And what can happen there is coastal squeeze. So as the sea level rises, the mangroves are getting stressed out on this side, but they can't retreat if there's the road there or other developments. And then this can also be a problem for the people that might live nearby if the mangroves aren't there, protecting against erosion and waves during storms. They might also suffer as well. So definitely something to think about and plan for in the future. An EPA report showed that sea level has increased about 4 inches since 1993 and could increase by 1 to 3 feet in the next century. So just showing you what it would look like. 1 foot already, some of these mangrove areas are probably going to be covered, and then 3 feet even more so. Past changes have definitely affected our mangrove distribution. So when the sea level was much, much higher in the past, like thousands of years ago, mangroves actually likely existed in Tumon. Judy Amesbury did a study on this looking at shellfish associated with mangroves. And there's also mangrove pollen and mangrove wood evidence that suggested they used to be here. So as sea level changes, there might be some pretty stark changes in the distribution of our mangroves. So just to review a little bit of what we've talked about so far, we want to understand public perspectives, prevent removal of mangroves, reach out to landowners, not just within their preserve, but also landowners might have mangroves, and see how we can conserve the mangroves on their property, increase education and awareness about their benefits for producing fish and preventing coastal erosion. We want to monitor our Bruguiera trees and make sure that they're not reproductively limited, that they can support their own population, and if not, support them. And we also want to think about how mangroves are going to cope with sea level rise. So along those lines, they might retreat, but they also could accrete enough sediment. So we can do some simple measurements with tiles to look at how much sediment accretes over time, or these markers in the sediment. We can take a core and see how much stuff accumulated on top of that over time. So these are some easy low-tech ways that we can first see if mangroves are accreting sediment. And then for our landowners, we want to, first of all, just understand them, what they're thinking about in terms of their land, their relationship with their land, with the mangroves and vegetation on their property. Maybe we can make some mutual goals and create some stewardship plans together to make sure their property doesn't experience erosion and protect plants on them. And then there's also other easement programs we could potentially implement. Easement being kind of like a formal arrangement or a contract where a landowner like limits certain uses on their land or allows people access to their land. And often they get like a tax break or something in return. So the Guam Land Conservation Act allows people to form kind of like easement agreements where they can make designated areas for wildlife conservation or wildlife habitat. Unfortunately, the minimum size is about 10 acres, which is way too big for our southern mangroves, even if everyone pooled together their land, which is allowed under this act, it wouldn't be enough. So we would probably have to modify this a little bit if we're trying to offer a tax break for protecting your mangroves on your property. And then this program from NRCS also offers like payment for the value of your land and payments to help restore wetlands on your land, but mangroves might not fit in. They're also a very small area and the program is competitively ranked and it's more meant for like former agricultural lands, but something to think about in the future or for other freshwater wetlands. All right, moving to Sasa Bay and Opera Harbor. So let's take a look at those areas here, Sasa Bay, and then a little bit south of that we have the Tatano wetland. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Please feel free to correct me at the end if I am. and then Abu Cove as well. So we'll start with Sasa Bay. Oh, and it looks similar to historical maps, also from 1974, similar kind of description. So we'll start with Sasa Bay. Here you can see some old aerial imagery. This dark band often likely was mangroves. And you can see a similar result. This is data from the Coastal Change Analysis Program by NOAA CCAP data. So the dark green represents trees 5 meters or greater, light green less than 5 meters, and then the yellow might not really be mangroves. It's kind of herbaceous vegetation, so like plants that don't have woody stems. So just a little bit more about this area. The Marianas Island Yacht Club was artificially created in 1944 to 1950. There's high typhoon damage in 2002, and there's been various oil spills and restoration sites. So we'll go through some of those past oil spills and restoration efforts. Their GORCO stands for Guam Oil and Refinery Company. So there was a spill in 1980, 1983. There was a pipeline refurbishment project in 2014 and 2015. Jessica Gross, if you know her, she worked on that a little bit for like mitigating for restoration. And then there's an ongoing project at the naval base by Comites Resources. I've gone in touch with Comites, but unfortunately they can't reveal that much information, and it seems like they're still in the planning phases. So looking at some pictures from 1980, you can see them responding to the oil spill with some pads to help soak up that oil, some of the damage that occurred due to the oil spill, and then some good-looking little saplings that are growing that they planted there to restore what was damaged. There also was a mariculture investigation into this area. Scientists introduced some oysters to see if they could grow and provide like aquaculture and food. It seems like the project didn't take off, but there have been various projects, it seems like, in this area. Jessica Gross also did a planting project in these 3 plots around the same area where that oil spill happened, and it was pretty successful growth. 1983, another oil spill a little bit farther up in a different area. You can see this area, this dashed line indicates some damage, and they planted along the transect. So you can see the damage here, a lot of dead mangroves, and then they planted some young mangroves along that transect. They tried planting Rhizophora and Avicennia, but only Rhizophora was able to survive. And then looking at some more aerial imagery closer to the Marianas Yacht Club, looks like there's been some change from 1994 to 2011. Some of this area opened up. These 3 boxes represent some more restoration sites. And over time, it looks like that restoration work has helped fill in some of these areas. You can see the gap was a little bit bigger back then, and it's starting to naturally recover. And even though there's gaps, there's still wildlife there. There's a lot of filler crabs. You can find a lot of bird footprints. So it's not necessarily like terrible. It still has some ecological value and some value as a habitat. There are some concerning things observing the trees there, mostly for this Avicennia. It looks like there might be some defoliation. So it looks like these branches, leaves fell off or they didn't grow or something. So that's a little uncertain why that's happening. That's from salinity stress, if the water's not draining well, if the anoxic soil without oxygen is producing a lot of toxic sulfides, maybe residual oil impacts. I'm not really certain, something that needs more investigation. And then sea level, of course, is an issue here as well. Over here, we have maybe some room where mangroves could retreat, but over by the road, especially, not as much room. They might experience that coastal squeeze a little bit in the 3-foot scenario. Another thing to take note of is potential fungal impacts. So there was storm impacts in the area, and storms can be made even worse if there's fungi that is deteriorating the tree. The fungi might not kill the tree outright, but it could weaken it and make it more susceptible to being broken during a storm. This particular piece of fungi was collected by a researcher studying mangroves and other trees in Yap. And apparently this fungi also might live in upland trees, so it might already be here and just not affect our mangroves. It's just something to keep our eyes out. If you do see any similar looking fungi, let me know. And then for a Tachino wetland, we have some growth back here, some maybe shorter growth in the front. And this looks pretty similar to what Randall and Eldridge reported in 1976, a little bit of mangrove around the river. And you can see this in the aerial imagery as well. So this area likely is all mangroves. And the author of this study also noted that there is a newly pure strand of Avicennia alba, so growing at this edge. Scott also reported in 1993 that this was the most developed area of mangroves in the Marianas with the biggest, I guess, like oldest growth of trees. So I have to learn more about this area. I honestly don't know that much. I asked the person doing the naval restoration project, and he said last time he visited the area, it looked pretty healthy, but didn't really have other further details about the heights of the trees or anything like that. And then moving down a little bit more towards Apple Cove, there's also some mangroves. And looking at the map, it looks like just small fringes of 2 meters, 5 meters, 1 meters. There's just a little bit of patchy mangroves in that inner Apple Harbor area. So management next steps for this particular spot. We also want to plan for sea level rise and investigate causes of plant stress. If we can find out more about why that tree was not having that many leaves, that would probably be really helpful. We could measure the pore water salinity, the amount of salt in the little bits of water in between the sediment particles, monitor drainage, is it just not draining well? And we also could monitor for presence of oils. There's oils will probably be pretty readily visible, like the surface, looking at little slicks. It shouldn't penetrate too far, and mangroves also have pretty shallow roots as well. And then communicating better with the Navy, we can learn more about their restoration project and their plans for sea level rise as well. And then existing protections for our mangroves. So major threat in the past was development, right? Removal for construction. So there's various federal and local protections for our mangroves. Some of these are the same thing as seagrasses, right? Section 404 of the Clean Water Act handles dredging and filling of areas. The RHAA affects navigable waterways, any projects constructing navigable waterways, and then NEPA also requires environmental impact statements. The biggest difference legally between mangroves and seagrasses is that mangroves are included in the definition of wetlands. So they can have some additional policies or like programs available to mangroves because they fall under wetlands. Locally, mangroves are protected by existing in the Achang Reflat Marine Preserve, so you're not supposed to remove them there. And then there's also some efforts for protection of wetlands. This particular effort wanted to designate an official wetland map and conduct some studies and legislate some protections for wetlands in particular. So we could follow up with the work that's been done for wetlands in general. And then the Guam Territory Seashore Act designates the seashore reserve out to 60 feet or meters beyond the shoreline and includes mangroves as well. So that might affect their protection. And then for restoration strategies, so our mangroves might have experienced some loss in the past due to development or due to other threats, and we can restore some of those areas. Just an estimate with the numbers, Scott in 1993 reported 70 hectares of mangroves, and the CCAP data, that remote sensing data in 2015/2016 showed about 50. This is rough because this is remote sensing, and Scott also was estimating without GIS tools, so the difference might not be as huge, but likely there's some differences. Mangrove restoration in general has been very popular worldwide. There's a lot more work on it, a lot of studies on it. It's relatively easier compared to seagrass or terrestrial tree restoration. Seagrasses are always in that wavy environment. Mangroves, at least, are not always being hit by waves. You also don't have to maybe dig as huge holes for mangroves. A lot of them are just small saplings. But there also has been mixed success. If you plant in the wrong areas, they oftentimes don't really grow, or they can get knocked over by like coconuts and driftwood. Some of what I am including in the next few slides is in consultation with the Mangrove Action Project. They're a nonprofit based out of the US that has worked in over 14 different countries restoring mangroves and partner with IUCN and Nature Conservancy and Wetlands International. So they're a really great resource, and I'm glad that I was able to connect with their director for some advice about what to do in Guam. So some different options and just ideas for thinking about restoring the mangrove ecosystem as a whole. First thing you want to do is make sure that the hydrology is working for the mangroves. This is especially more prominent in like areas that were converted to shrimp ponds for agriculture. They break up those shrimp ponds to allow water to flow back in, and usually the mangroves kind of naturally restore themselves as long as the water is flowing correctly. This diagram shows creating tidal channels in response to an oil spill that can help flush the area out as well, and also just make sure the mangroves aren't constantly waterlogged, and that just makes it harder for them to get oxygen and increases the amount of sulfide in the sediments, like that smelly gas, if you've ever stepped in mud, is representative of sulfide. And it can also make the soil really saline. So if you have any depressions in the soil, so like any dips in the ground where that's a little lower elevation, seawater can come in on the tide, stay in that little area, that's a little puddle, and then the water evaporates with the sun and leaves behind salt, and then it creates a super salty area where it's really hard for anything to grow. So just looking at the land is really important for understanding how mangroves can survive in that area. And then poor drainage, if it's not draining well, it can lead to stunted growth for mangroves. So this Lumnitzer, different species than what we have here, but same concept. It's growing in a poorly drained area, and as a result, it's growing stunted. So it's not growing tall like this picture. It's like spreading out horizontally while still very small. So that can be representative of stress. It looks like our mangroves aren't very stunted, but something to keep an eye out for. More stress also means more root growth, so they have to expend more energy making roots to survive in this stressful environment. So if they're permanently flooded, which most of our mangroves are, they have a ton of roots, which most of our mangroves do. That's kind of normal, but it's just making the point that mangroves, even though they can live in salty water, they actually do need freshwater input, and it makes them survive better and have less stress. For the actual restoration techniques of planting, there's different options. We can plant directly. This is better for larger propagules, like those big string beans. You can plant them directly. We can grow them for a little bit too, or plant them directly. But for our smaller ones, like this Avicennia, which is like a little lima bean size, that's really hard for them to stay in place and not get knocked over. We want to grow those for probably several months until a couple of leaves have developed and some woody growth has developed, and of course the root structure. But there's a trade-off. The longer you grow them, then the more shock they're going to have when you transplant them. When you're growing them in nurseries, you can start with fresh water. They'll grow perfectly fine with fresh water, and then slowly acclimate them. So a lot of times nurseries will be near some kind of tidal area so that they can get fresh water, and then you can kind of ease them in to the salt water habitat. Other ideas that people have used include community buyback programs. So it's kind of like an adopt a mangrove program. People grow the seedlings in their property and then bring them back for planting day. So that's another way to also incorporate like outreach and public participation if interested. When you finally do the planting, a major threat, like I said earlier, is things knocking the mangroves over. So there's been various techniques people have used to prevent this, slow down the waves and prevent things knocking it over. Here they're constructing a rock wall in front of their mangroves. And when they're finally established, they can take that rock wall down. bamboo. Here they're putting a ton of bamboo like stakes into the ground to slow down that water. Here they built like a bamboo fence. So all of these things will help protect those seedlings as they establish their roots. A lot of them are also pretty tasty to crabs and other wildlife, so like insects. So this is from Jessica Gross's planting project in 2015. She had some netting on this little seedling, putting them in buckets to elevate them. So that has been a major source of loss of our seedlings in the past. It's just them getting eaten. And there's some different restoration considerations with choosing what to plant. For our Rhizophora, with their big prop roots, they're really great for providing fish habitat, a lot of structure for fish to hide in. They absorb a lot of wave energy, and they're also relatively easy to plant because their propagules are huge. So they're like kind of an easy winner, but we also have other considerations to take as well. So Avicennia and Bruguiera, they're a little less common. Avicennia is supposed to be a pioneer species that can help maybe increase our mangrove area in general, especially on the more seaward facing side. But it looks like in our Marianas Yacht Club site, at least, they weren't that hardy because they're losing leaves. So even though there's been a lot of scientific literature and consulting with other people, they're supposed to be really hardy. There might be maybe variations between our two species. We'd have to look into that a little bit more. They also need a little extra help to help them grow because their propagules are smaller. For Bruguiera, that was the species I mentioned was impacted by the invasive tree snake. So we want to maybe help their population if they're experiencing difficulties reproducing, and that can help maintain our diversity. And there's lots of other less common species. Xylocarpus I haven't even mentioned at all. The Nipa palm, those all also can help provide diversity, and we want to make sure they continue to exist. They also exist in lower numbers as well. So different kind of trade-offs for considering what to plant. In general, it seems like we can probably try to focus on Bruguiera since it really might not be making many propagules. So the ones that does make, we want to help them, give them a head start to help them survive. And then Avicennia, we can work on methods to help make sure those guys do okay, they don't get eaten, they grow okay. And Rhizophora, since it's a little bit easier, we can plant them as time allows. And then it was also a suggestion from that Mangrove Action Project consultation that we can enhance the natural recruits in our covered areas. So rather than focusing on like, we're gonna plant in this one spot and recover this one spot and like measure the size grown in this particular area, we can kind of just enrich like what we already see is growing naturally. So if we see a lone mangrove growing by itself, we can plant some friends next to it, and that will help them have better resistance against waves or better survive in those soils without oxygen. They put oxygen into the sediment. If you're here during the seagrass talk, we run over that. And them as a big group can help them survive better. We can also plant among any cut down mangroves. This is actually great for preventing them from getting washed away by waves. So we can plant in damaged areas. And this is an example of like a little lone mangrove where we could help supplement and just put a few more in that area. And then of course, we also want to work on just increasing education and appreciation for our mangroves. People have built boardwalks, signage might be another option. People have raised bees, honeybee keeping and mangrove honey is a thing in certain areas. Farron suggested connecting our mangroves with Punglao and the Crab Festival to help raise appreciation of how they offer valuable habitat to these crabs. And then there's different art projects. So lots of ways. If you have any ideas, I would love to hear how we can increase our awareness and appreciation of mangroves. So with that, I'll finish up. Thank you to all the different organizations that have offered their input and support to help protect our mangroves and help gather information about our mangroves. Special thanks to Whitney, my supervisor, who has helped review a lot of my materials and helped me gain access to them. Farron and Marie, who have helped me explore the mangroves and helped develop that landowner survey. and of course, all of these other people that have offered lots of valuable time and effort into providing their input. If you have any observations about mangroves, I'd love to hear them. We're creating a community observation map. So these are a lot of historical observations. And if you've seen like an area that was cut down, or even like an interesting animal or something inside the mangroves, or you went fishing near the mangroves and caught some particular fish, I'd love to add that observation to the map. We have a few different working drafts. If you want to learn more about how they provide valuable things to our community, their ecology, how they're protected legally, restoration techniques, these are all like their own little chapter. I can send it to you. It's a work in progress though. And there's different education and outreach stuff that we've done in the past year. If you want to learn more about that, we have our little mangrove and seagrass character here. So if you have any interest in seeing more of our outreach stuff, feel free to let me know. And some references. And thank you very much for your time and listening. Feel free to chime in with any questions. So I'll stop sharing. Right, so I'll go ahead and look at some of the questions. Will the recordings? Yeah, so this one is recording and I can make that available. Somehow I can probably upload it to like Google Drive and send it out to the registration list. Unfortunately, I was a little nervous last week and I didn't record the seagrass, but I can totally send you the slides, and I can also just record myself talking. I don't mind that at all if you're interested. So I can definitely send that, Viviana. Thank you, Youngie. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Thank you for your time in watching the presentations. Maria, you mentioned different laws for the protection of mangroves. Which law or regulation specifically prohibits landowners? Yeah, so good question. So definitely within the marine preserves, it's illegal to cut them down, right? And then on the landowner's property, it's not. I think you would have to ask a little bit more from Chelsea or Edwin, who work at GCMP and know more about the Territorial Seashore Act. That might make it a little like illegal technically to cut it down, but I'm actually not quite certain. I don't think there's any other specific law in place that says it's illegal to cut mangroves down. It's mostly the marine preserve that protects them from that. Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Joni. Yeah, sure. I can definitely send a recording out to the whole group at the end. Any other questions? I can also bring up the slides if there's any particular slide that you had questions if it wasn't clear. Okay, I'm confused as to whether mangrove trees like Rhizophora are facultative or obligate halophytes. I see papers about both, but what's your take? Good question. Yeah, so I guess they're kind of like physiologically, I would say facultative, because they can survive in freshwater, and they might even survive a little bit better. But in terms of like, maybe they're obligate, especially in terms of like community ecology, because if they tried to live anywhere else, they would get outcompeted by other plants. And I'm sure they also have certain mechanisms that they've evolved over like millions of years to live in saltwater. So if they were to live their whole life in freshwater, I don't know if that might affect them, because their physiology is just meant for dealing with saltwater. Oh, and if facultative means like you don't have to have it, and obligate means you have to have it. And halophyte is a plant that lives, that requires salt, if that helps at all. I don't know. So like a lot of people would say, yeah, me too. I've grown mangrove propagule just with freshwater before, and it seemed to be doing great. And they also recommend that when you do mangrove restoration, you do it when it's the rainy season, because there's more fresh water, I guess, entering the habitat. So yeah, Mike.
Cara, this is Mike. I might comment on our park, the national park in Saipan. We have Bruguiera growing, and I've been monitoring the water quality at the sites, and this is the only mangrove species that we find in Saipan nowadays. And they're inner areas of the park that are practically freshwater, and they have good growth of the Bruguiera. But adjacent to that area, going out into the salt water where you normally find Rhizophora, we've got also healthy Bruguiera. And it's kind of interesting to look at the differences in the salinities and how it affects zoning. Normally, we've seen other mangrove forests, like in Guam or through Micronesia, there'll be a more distinct zonation. But apparently there's some flexibility there. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. That's so interesting. I'm glad you shared that observation, because I think the Bruguiera here, I need to like go out into more observation, but just from a quick look, it seems like they live pretty close to where the river output is occurring. So it might be less saline there as well. So I think Bruguiera maybe does a little bit better in the slightly fresher environment.
May I mention something else about Bruguiera? Working through Micronesia, I've been looking at mangroves for many years all through the islands. And in the Marshall Islands, where you basically have no standing fresh water, the only mangrove they have is Bruguiera. And it's on some of the atoll islands and the depressions there. Kind of amazing that that's there, not Rhizophora.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about why there'd be Bruguiera there in freshwater areas, but not Rhizophora along the coast. Maybe the sediment isn't right, or the it's like too wavy or something. So yeah, it's interesting. It's also interesting, I think in Saipan, they're planning to introduce Rhizophora. So I don't know if Zach is still here. He could tell you more, but they wrote a proposal to take Propagules from Guam to plant them in Saipan.
I'd like to learn more about that. I'll be in touch with you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike, I'll shoot you an email about that.
Okay. Thanks,
I know we had a conversation over a year ago about that, but yeah, moving forward.
Great.
Yeah, I hope it's successful.
Thanks for your help on that.
Yeah. Regarding the, so Edwin has a response about the legal protections regarding cutting down mangroves. So there's no clear enforcement. Yeah, it's really hard because like once they've been cut and burned, it's like, what do you do then? You can't really tell necessarily who did it. Yeah, and I need to look up an update about that particular site where they're cut down in Achan Reef Preserve. Have you looked at how typhoons affect mangroves in Guam and how they help? Yeah, so I think maybe not so much in Guam in particular. I didn't find that much, but definitely they can both be really important and get really injured by typhoons. Like in Florida, at least, people will tie their boats up in little mangrove areas before the huge storm to help protect them. And at the same time, after I think hurricane, one of their most recent hurricanes, there's like huge deaths, just like giant patches of mangrove death, really starkly contrasting with the live mangroves, probably just due to like the wind destroying them and also like getting too salted out. And it's not just the mangroves themselves, stuff living on the mangroves can get affected by the typhoon. So when it's churning up so much water and sediment, at least in Florida, they found a bunch of sponges die. There was a huge sponge die off because the sediment was washed up so much that they just couldn't filter it.
If I may comment again, this is Mike again. And looking at the same mangrove species that are throughout Micronesia, getting to the east where there's very little typhoon activity, like in Koshrai, the species like Rhizophora are more than twice as tall as the forests of Rhizophora in the Marianas, or in Guam, I mean. And we've always attributed that to typhoons. And recently, for example, in Saipan, the mangrove areas were hit by Typhoon U2, and it broke off tops of trees and all. It kind of gives the impression that there's a cutting back or a prevention of mangroves growing up big because of the frequent typhoons.
Right,
I don't have any really good evidence of that, but that's what it appears.
Yeah, that's definitely because like there's some reports that show storms might increase in severity or frequency, right, with climate change. So that's another thing. If they happen more frequently, the mangroves might not have as much time to recover. afterwards. So definitely something to look into more. Oh yeah, so Michael could tell you more about Hurricane Irma and its impacts on mangroves in Florida. Do you know if brown tree snakes inhabit mangrove stands? Possibility of research birth in spite of. Yeah, so I actually don't know. I should look more into that. Like, are the Micronesian honeyeaters getting, would they normally be in like upland forests and mangroves and then get killed by snakes in upland forests, or are they only in mangroves? I think, Zach, you mentioned that when you're in the mangroves, you hear Micronesian honeyeaters, like they're chirping or something, right? Do you know if they exist in upland areas as well?
Great question. I guess I spend so much time in the mangroves. That's just where mainly I see them. I can't answer to whether or not they're in the uplands. But they're certainly, I not only hear them, I just see tons of them in the mangroves. So they're plentiful there.
Okay, so yeah, maybe that's another thing in reintroduction. I guess if they went extinct at some point, that could happen again. So I don't know. We'd have to look more into it. Any EBL people? No. Yeah, did I miss anyone's questions? Any other questions? The one you missed? If anyone planning to restore mangroves in areas that might be or in the PD routes. Yeah, so that's another idea. Like, there was one UOG report that like very like in passing mentioned like, oh, mangroves are often found in river mouths without specifying a particular river mouth. So it might be like they exist in the south and in Sasa Bay and just like in little clumps along river mouths. So that could be another option. You don't want to like clog normal draining patterns. So that's a big thing in like mangrove restoration. You'll find it in manuals. It'll be like, do not plant in channels because it can clog the channel and then you can actually kill mangroves behind it, or just it can cause a big mess with the hydrology pattern. Yeah, and Nipa also, yeah, planting Nipa, that would be, I would love to learn more about that and what that process is like. And I think they also don't have super high numbers, right? So Brent, if you want to share any more about that, I'd love to hear. Any other questions? Thank you for your great questions. Yeah, interesting to find Nipa in other areas, their historical extents. I think in Guamopedia, they said that Nipa used to be used for weaving, so probably was abundant enough to be found for weaving purposes at some point. There's one Avicennia tree. Potentially, I think like mangroves here are probably limited by wave action. So like the southern coast has a little more protection, like being part of Cocos Lagoon, and then Sasa Bay is protected, right? So any time there's a lot of wave energy, especially for fringing mangroves, it would be hard for them to establish. Maybe if like there's differences in sea levels, you could probably also look for like mangrove pollen. I don't know how to do that. So you need an expert in like paleoecology to look at if there was mangrove pollen and stuff, so traces of mangroves and sediments in other areas. Yeah, grow really well in limestone. Interesting. Cool. I should add that to the community observation map, the one lone mangrove around MA Island. Has anyone taken any sediment cores in our mangroves? So yeah, I think maybe Judy can speak more about how they did some of those archaeology studies in the mangroves where they looked for mangroves pollen, and they also found shellfish that were associated with mangroves. I don't know if Julie is still here. Julie, are you here? Maybe not. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think they must have done some kind of coring studies for that. And it's pretty common in other areas. You can learn a lot about like past sea level rise from like lead isotope dating. You can learn about the biogeochemistry. There's a lot of stuff. There's fauna animals that live inside the mud. So definitely interesting if you took some sediment course. We found the fossil crabs. Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah, and Scott in 1993, his wetland account of wetlands also mentions like Nipa and Taupofo. He has a pretty good report of like breaking it down by region and like estimated areas and notable observations. If you want to see that, if you haven't already. Report summary, species. That could be fun. I would be worried about crashing into a tree though. Yeah, so I'll make a note of that as well. So yeah, if any of you, I can follow up with you if you don't mind about these observations, so we can add them to that map, and it's Google Maps, so it's super accessible for anyone to look at in the future. Interesting. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, that also opens up the conversation for more like potential areas to plant them, not just in the south or in Sasa Bay. Any other comments or questions? That was a great discussion.
That was an awesome talk, Kara. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to talk about mangroves with us.
Oh,
I'm sure if anyone has any other questions, they think about it later, they could probably contact you.
Yeah, sure. Feel free that my email is, I think I sent it to you for the invites, right? So feel free to email back anytime.
Perfect. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. So Poets is actually going to be taking a break for the next 2 weeks, and we will return on April 9th for a talk by Dr. Peter Hauk from the Marine Lab. So thank you again, Kara, and thank you to everyone else, and enjoy the rest of your day. And have a good weekend, everyone.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you so much.